Im Rahmen der Veranstaltungsreihe der Wiener Gesellschaft für interkulturelle Philosophie im Wintersemester 2024 spricht Bianca Boteva-Richter mit dem Philosophen David Johnson von Boston College in den USA.
Dear colleagues, dear friends of the Intercultural Philosophy, today we have as our guest the Associate Professor of Philosophy David Johnson. He is Director of Asian Studies and from Boston College, and he will talk to us today about what is nature. But before we get to the topic itself, I would like to introduce him briefly. David Johnson joined the faculty of Boston College in 2013, having previously been a visiting scholar at the Albert Ludwigs Universität Freiburg. You speak a little bit German, is it right? Yeah. And he was also at the Nansen Institute for Religion and Culture in Nagoya, Japan, and at the International Research Center for Japanese Study in Kyoto, Japan. He was also, I think, a research fellow at the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona.
Right. Yes.
Yes, it's right. Okay. Welcome, David, and thank you very much for taking the time for this interview.
Well, thank you very much, Bianca, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. This year in May and June, you were also a research fellow at the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen. There you worked on your new book project. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about this project and especially about your new book, which is called Between Self and No Self, a Cross-Cultural Phenomenology of Life?
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for asking. Yes, I was at the University of Copenhagen for 2 months. You may know that there's a scholar of phenomenology who's well-known, based there, named Dan Zahavi. He's an expert in Husserl. And so I was there for 2 months thinking about and working on the phenomenological concept of self. Mm-hmm. So that is to say, the experiential self, the self mm-hmm. as perhaps intrinsic to conscious experience. Mm-hmm. And the reason for my interest in that particular notion is because I think it's a key notion that can be found across many different disciplines and is really essential for any talk of self. So you might even see it as a foundational notion that conscious experience entails self-experience is the presupposition for example, a narrative concept of self, because you would have to be self-aware at some even implicit level in order to then develop reflective self-awareness. And then from there, over a temporally extended period, to tell stories about one's life. Conscious self-experience is essential for other reflective forms of self-understanding, self-concepts, and so on. And so the reason that I'm interested in that particular notion is because I guess you could say the book starts with an intuition, a basic kind of intuition that works on two levels. So on the one hand, we have this ideal in the West that's not very explicitly or frequently acknowledged, and that's the ideal of self-making or self-fashioning, becoming a certain kind of perhaps singular personality. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the culture, it's part of the way that people think. We admire figures like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Churchill, and we sometimes think of personalities, these great personalities, as impacting history. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, this is a moral ideal about what it means to be perhaps successful, but certainly to have a flourishing life. And you might say opposed to that, there's another ideal in East Asian culture, especially manifest in Buddhism, which is the loss of self, that one should be selfless, that one should let go of this illusion of self, and that there you'll find true spiritual flourishing. These ideas seem to be, of course, in tension with one another, and yet at the same time perhaps because of my reading of Isaiah Berlin and other value pluralists, I have the sense that, and I sort of hope that, and I mean, I ask, could it be possible that these are two moral ideals that are both possibilities for human life, that are both ways of being human?
Yeah.
And if so, how can we reconcile them?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can reconcile it through value pluralism, that there are different notions of the good. And then on another level, the question of the book will be, what about metaphysically then, right? How can we have both a self, but also a no self? And so that's really the heart of the book, is trying to work out that possibility through phenomenology.
Yes, this is something really exciting and very new, because I personally never read or heard about a concept, especially of the no self, through phenomenology. This is something new, I think. I'm very much interested in, but not to lose our line or our main topic. I will not go further into asking of the concept of no self, but I'm also interested if in this, your new project, if you also explore the concept of the betweenness, because this is a concept which is attracting more and more philosophical attention, and not only in Asia, but also in Europe or in US. Do you work on this concept also in this project or not?
Yes, I think it's there. It's not foregrounded as the central concept, but it's definitely necessary for what I want to do. And so let me try to give two examples. And the notion of betweenness that I work on comes from Kimura Bin, the psychiatrist and phenomenologist, who was influenced by and, of course, borrowed the concept, appropriated from Watsuji Tetsuro. And he calls this Aida, as you know, whereas Watsuji called it Aidagara. And so Aida is important in two senses for the project. First, the idea of the self that I'm working with here is the idea of the self as having two tiers. And one tier is the one we're all familiar with, a private individual subjectivity, but then also a sense in which this subjectivity is the bearer of a collective subjectivity. And so, in a way, the subject is, or the self, you might say, is between this private individual experience of subjectivity and also immersed in, whether it realizes or not, the collective subjectivity that's constitutive for us. And so we're between these in a way. And interestingly enough, with the concept of selflessness, there's also an aspect that's not much explored, and that is the aspect of being selfless insofar as we are immersed in collective life. And that can, of course, have negative connotations, as we know.
Yes,
we're
not
here,
only. Yes.
We're here in Austria, we're here in Vienna. And so politically and socially, we know the direction that can take in terms of, say, fascism or totalitarianism. But there's also another sense in which we can lose at least our sense of our need to be outstanding individuals and singular personalities, insofar as we submit ourselves to immerse ourselves in communal life and understand the meaning of our life in terms of something much larger. So here I'm thinking of, for example, of the Bauhäuser that were the lodges of the craftsmen that were at the base of these great cathedrals. And they would spend their entire life helping to build the cathedral. And these artisans in general were not interested necessarily in putting their names on things. They were part of this collective effort for something like a cathedral that would last for 1,000 years. And there's a kind of satisfaction and even a form of flourishing and happiness that can come from this kind of participation. And it's an ancient, pre-modern, I think, ideal of what it means to live a good life, that one doesn't have to become this very outstanding individual talent or artist or athlete, but can in fact see oneself as belonging to something much larger. So that's the sense of betweenness and selflessness that I see in in Kimura's work. That's at least one aspect of selflessness that I see in Kimura's work that's linked up with the notion of Ida or betweenness. The second aspect that I will look at is the betweenness within the self itself and not between selves.
Okay. This is something new to me, yeah.
And so when we think about what subjectivity is and what are its enabling conditions, close and careful phenomenological description should reveal, or will reveal actually, that there is probably at the ground of our activity and our willing and our doing a certain kind of impersonal, how shall we say, unfolding that is not in our control. The heart is beating, the blood is circulating, we are excreting sweat, our body is aging and it's caught up in the rhythms of the seasons. When someone is pregnant, they're sort of seized by some force as they give birth in these labor pangs. And so there's some ground that, as I think one of the Japanese philosophers says, it might have been someone commenting on Kimura, who says, it's not that we're alive, but that we're being kept alive, right? And so we draw on and belong to this wider sort of force of nature, you might say, that discloses how we are interwoven with the world. And so the Japanese term for this is that Kimura appropriates is onozukara, which is the way that things happen of themselves or by themselves. So there's something between onozukara, these impersonal forces that are essential to be a living subject, and mizukara, the individual willing and doing and acting. And so there really is a passage from nature to self in the development of the human being. But you might say, the ideal of unselfing in something like Buddhism would be to arrive at a place between what happens of itself, onozukara, and what I do on my own, mizukara, such that I live out the happening of itself, onozukara, in a way that's from myself, mizukara.
We'll come to this point a little bit later, once again. But our topic today is, as announced, the concept of nature from an European Japanese philosophical point of view. I came up with the idea for this interview because 2019 you brought out a very important publication entitled Watsuji on Nature, Japanese Philosophy in the Wake of Heidegger. Could you please first briefly explain to our listeners who Watsuji is and how you became aware of this Japanese philosopher?
Yes, Watsuji Tetsuro is an important philosopher and intellectual from the 20th century. He's born, I think, in 1889, but at the end of the 19th century, and he dies in 1960.
60, yes,
so
exactly. Yeah.
He covers that first very, very important period in the modernization of Japan, just really after Meiji gets going. And he was really almost a polymath. He has a wide range of interests. He was interested in literature. He translated Byron, I think, when he was in school. And he was interested in art and poetry. He was the first person to introduce the Japanese to Kierkegaard, and one of the first, if not the first, to introduce them to Nietzsche. And he has an early study on Nietzsche, which is really quite interesting. And the interpretation that he gives there of Nietzsche is actually quite similar in some ways to another interpretation offered by a guest that was also on this program, Professor Graham Parks. So that's an interesting sort of echo. But Watsuji, he perhaps the most important thing to know about him in some ways is that as he was developing his academic career and eventually moved to Kyoto University, where he was a colleague of Nishida Kitaro rather than a student, he was sponsored by the Japanese government to go to Germany and study and to improve, sort of research and improve his knowledge. And he took a ship. This should have been around 1927. He took a ship from Japan and it stopped in China. Then it went down the Malaysian peninsula and it went to Sri Lanka, and then from Sri Lanka he went to Aden and up the Suez Canal and then into Italy. He traveled up through Italy and then into Germany. He also saw England. This was a very important trip for him because it sort of foregrounded the ways in which the life world is shaped by natural climates and locales. And so he develops this concept of geocultural climate, or fudo in Japanese. And he uses that to expand Heidegger's notion of being in the world and to explicate the dimension of nature in world as Heidegger conceives it. He also expands the notion of Dasein to see it, to view it as a being in relation to others. So this is sort of, I think, his great contribution. It is an overcoming of certain kinds of dualities through this rethinking of both nature and self.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And Fudo is very, very well translated in German. Actually, I think even better than in English. But even if this book is his best known in a German-speaking world, even more than ethics as science of human or ethics. Books which are the most important of his work. Even if Fudo is very, very famous, it can be, I think, misunderstood if it's not placed in context with his other works. If I may quote you, you wrote in Watsuji Nature, I quote, to fully grasp Watsuji's theory on Fudo, climate and culture must be read together with the third volume of Ethics. How is that meant?
Yes, well, there's an initial meaning there. And so part of what we see in Fudo is a kind of patriotic and perhaps overzealous presentation of Japanese culture, the so-called Japanese personality, as grounded in its very special or unique Fudo. And this is a problem, partly because when he writes this, this is before World War II gets going in earnest for the Japanese. And one can see already a kind of proto-nationalism in this text, one that will emerge full-blown later in the early volumes of the Ethics, the first volume. And so when we get to the third volume of the Ethics, what we see there, this is in 1949, we see a kind of revision. It's almost as if he's reconsidering what he said.
Exactly, yes.
And so instead of seeing perhaps the Japanese personality as specially endowed with a certain kind of sensitivity and certain kinds of superior qualities, he's able to take a kind of critical distance from this sort of discourse. And so in the third volume, he actually begins to criticize Japanese culture for its stress and overemphasis on filial piety, for example, at the expense of other kinds of relations, such as the relations between husband and wife, or the relation of the citizen to the political domain, to the government. And what he finds problematic in the relations that he does address is the lack of a critical and critically aware consciousness of individual as something that has to have a certain kind of independence or distance from these social structures. So there are various discussions about why this happened and whether there was a kind of opportunism or whether this was sincere because after all the war had been lost. I think it's an open question. What we do know is that he certainly made an attempt to reconsider his views. And so that's partly what I meant by having to take that together with the third part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but nonetheless, Fudo is very important because it is the first time, I think, or it is an attempt to work out the human being as climatic being, and also to work out the human being or the self as a new kind, as a synthetic or hybrid being. So therefore, I think this is something very, very interesting, and therefore I would like to ask you, and also to lead us now to the concept of nature, how Watsuji's concept of the self as Ningen affects the relationship between human and nature, or how is the relationship according to this concept of the self or of the being?
Yes, thank you. That's an important question. So I think there are two initial things to say about this. And the first is that Watsuji allows us to see how the being of the human being depends on its immersion in natural contexts. And this means in terms of its self-understanding. And so for Watsuji, part of what it means to be human is to understand oneself as or having particular social roles or identities and particular self-conceptions. And this is an insight, of course, that comes from Heidegger, who phrases it as taking a stand on one's being and so on. But perhaps what Heidegger didn't see, according to Watsuji, is the ways in which these modes of self-apprehension really depend or rely on the natural environment, the geocultural environment that we are caught up in and really immersed in. And so being a sari mat, not a sari mat, but a sari weaver, a weaver of the sari, or a tatami mat weaver, or someone who sells a certain kind of beverage, such as the tea that people like to drink in Argentina. This really depends, of course, on what natural materials are available, what natural resources are at hand, what nature, so to speak, offers us. So there's a kind of materiality in self-understanding that itself is tied to locale that is an enabling condition for particular historical self-conceptions that perhaps Heidegger overlooks. So that's sort of the first part of what he offers. And the second part of this is, I don't think, of course, he speaks about this, but it's something that we can see now with this historical distance. And that is the ways in which climate change or environmental devastation can impact the possibility of such forms of self-understanding. That we can actually lose the ability to be a shrimp fisherman or the ability to be someone who herds camel and so on. So what's lost with the loss of habitat is not only particular species, which is terrible enough, but also lifeways. And that's a damage that we can describe as existential damage. It's not the kind of damage that can be restituted by new technologies or a particular kind of instrumental approach to fixing, so to speak, the problem. Because once these habitats are so degraded or destroyed that such lifeways can't emerge, these forms of being human, these possibilities of being human are gone forever.
As far as I understood his elaboration of the self as Ningen, he puts the nature, he's not only explaining that the nature is something outside of us and we interact somehow, but he puts the nature within ourselves. He regards the nature as a kind of, even of identity aspect. Is this correct? And how can it be understood? That the nature, okay, we are natural somehow. This is something we know, but the nature as a kind of identical aspect, as a kind of the same as a language, for example, or as cultural habit or something. This is something very special. This is something I saw in his explanations, but not in other philosophical texts or something. Can you explain it a little bit?
Right. Yes. There's an ontological. If I addressing what you have in mind, there's an ontological aspect of Fudo as well that is not as clearly articulated as the existential aspect that I just addressed, which had to do with forms of self-understanding as they are tied to natural locales. But then there's an ontological aspect here. And you may remember there's a famous passage in which he talks about the cold air.
Yes,
sort of,
we are the cold.
We are out in the
we
cold.
Are cold
we
in
are
the
standing
cold.
out in
the
cold.
Yeah.
And I think there are sort of two aspects to this. One is taken from Heidegger, this notion of existere, we're standing out among things through our forms of comportment. That there's not an enclosed subject who is separated off from the world, but is in fact out there among things and constituted by it. So that's one aspect. The other part of it, I think, comes from this Japanese background. And there we have the notion of shizen, or nature. And this is a notion that is very ancient, comes from China. And it's very difficult on this view and with this concept to separate out self and nature.
Exactly,
They're
yes.
really aspects of the same thing in a way. And so nature is what I am. And this notion of a deep intertwining with or continuity with the natural world is also what allows us to see why it is the case that the human being is the kind of being that belongs to, inheres in, and comes to expression in a geocultural climate or a geocultural milieu.
The other interesting aspect is that the kind of interwoven nature and culture in the self. Therefore, the translation of Fudo in German or even in English is, I think, climate and culture.
That's right.
Climate and culture, yes. This is these two concepts, climate and culture, they don't belong together in the European philosophy, if I may say, a little bit simplifying. But he brings it together in Ningen, and he explains and he shows that we are natural and cultural in the same time. We are natural in the aspect, as you told us before, that we are part of the cold, or the cold is part of us. We transcend the climatic phenomena, but at the same time, we are also cultural. As humans, we try to protect ourselves from typhoons or climatic, from cold, from other climatic phenomena. And this is something very interesting, but what do you think about this hybrid concept of the self? What is nature according this concept? To turn the question around, what is nature based on this new concept of the self?
Well, yes, that's a good question, but
difficult question.
and I may have to go beyond perhaps what Watsuji himself says. But nature for Watsuji in this context would be the experiential domain of the lived experience of nature. And so, because he's a phenomenologist of a certain strain, and because he's also someone quite influenced by hermeneutics, this means that our experience of nature, like any experience, is always mediated by context, cultural context. And so nature is mediated. Our experience of nature is mediated by the forms of culture that belong to our life. And so anything that we can encounter as nature is always a river walk, or a natural reserve, or a fishing lake, or a hiking trail. There's no pure nature, so to speak, in human experience, but there's only something meaningful, something already structured, something that is part of a wider world, the world that I belong to. And so in that sense, nature is present to us through culture. But if nature is mediated through culture, culture is also present to us through nature. And so that means that the forms of architecture that we have, the food that we eat, the practices that we undertake to earn our living, all of these forms of culture are already shaped and in some ways given through the particular habitat that we belong to. So if I'm a shrimp fisherman, it's also because I'm in the Gulf of Mexico. And if my buildings are painted white, it has to do perhaps with the sun and the brightness of the sun. And if I'm living in a tent, that has to do also with perhaps the steppe and the wind and the kinds of movements that I have to make to pursue herds of animals. So nature is present to us through culture, and culture is present to us through nature. So that's the aspect of that's sort of part of the meaning of nature for Watsuji and Fudo. And then if we think about what Shizen is and what it has been, we know that it's taken up into Japanese Buddhism, and we know that the reading of the word there is jinen. And so there's a sense of nature that is not explored in detail by Watsuji, I think it's intimated and hinted at, that has to do with nature as some mysterious and perhaps even salvific source, as we find in certain forms of Buddhism.
Yes.
And that's just a way of saying that nature is not reducible to what culture makes of it.
Yes, exactly.
It always outstrips
Yeah.
and exceeds. There's a kind of mysteriousness and power in nature that we already see with something like Onuskara.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to give the impression that this is merely an interpretation, and nature is just what we interpret it to be,
Yeah.
because interpretation here means the interpretation of something that transcends my modes of taking up what is presented.
Mm-hmm.
It is more than, and certainly transcendent to, my own construals.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of interaction between the modes of disclosure that Watsuji addresses, feelings or affectivity, language, and then finally practices.
Mm-hmm.
As there's an interaction between these modes of disclosure and the natural world itself, so to speak, what is presented to me. Mm-hmm. And in that intersection, that's where our experience of nature emerges.
Mm-hmm.
But that, of course, means that nature is not reducible to what we experience. You might say it's one of the faces of nature.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is very interesting because since Aristotle, we have the problem, and later even more with a kind of a gap between nature and culture, and between Techne and Physis, and between artificial and natural beauty. So in this sense, or seeing the self as ningen, and including the nature within ourselves, but also regarding this interaction between nature and culture, we don't have so much problems with this gap. There is no gap to be overcome. Is that correct? Or?
Well, I think that's the ideal. I think that's the ideal.
Yeah.
And the perhaps one more thing to say about this relation between nature and culture, mm-hmm. is that it's very easy to think of this perhaps as a kind of relativism, mm-hmm. that there are just these different faces of nature that we disclose and open up, and through our practices and our language. That's how it sometimes seems, that there mm-hmm. are different geocultural climates that some people might mistakenly, of course, view as constructions that we work up. But it really points to a deeper philosophical problem, and that's the problem mm-hmm. of objectivity and universality.
Yes.
And so Klaus Held mm-hmm. has actually, the German phenomenologist who's recently passed away, has had toward the later part of his career taken up Watsuji's work.
Oh, really?
Yes, in his concept of Lebenswelt Natur.
Oh, this is very interesting.
Yes, he has a book about this. And what interested Held about Watsuji was that Held himself had as one of his aims to explain. So on the one hand, in phenomenology, the life world is kind of ontologically fundamental. Mm-hmm. There isn't a more objective or truer standpoint that would really get to things as they are in themselves. Mm-hmm. What we have is this immersive standpoint. Mm-hmm. And what Held wanted to know was something like, how can we ensure that this standpoint, while not objective, has universal validity, especially given that there are so many different cultural standpoints.
Yeah.
How do we preserve the universality, perhaps you might say, of the life world, given that it is an immersive and subjective standpoint? What we know is that we can't reduce this to more objective elements. We can't slip into naturalism and think of this as an objective. We can't objectify the life world.
Yes, exactly.
In order to get universality.
Yeah.
And yet universality is a problem. And so Hill thinks that, well, in fact, there is a system of polarities in Watsuji's work that have to do with the elements and with the temperatures. So hot and cold, wet and dry.
Yes,
you know,
exactly. Yeah.
That structure all of the different cultural life worlds that are geocultural climates. And so what he finds is that we can appeal to a kind of basic universality of elements that run through the various cultures and that give, I think he puts it, every world its own sky, right? So on one hand, there is variation in life worlds. They are different, as the theory of Fudo shows. On the other hand, what they all have in common is some configuration of the same elements that are shared all across the life world. But they're configured differently in each case. And he says, from this embodied participation in nature, there's been a long historical process of abstraction. So from the sky, whichever sky it is, a Greek sky perhaps, or in ancient times, but from the sky, human beings eventually abstract out the concept of space as a homogeneous domain. And through the changes in the weather in the sky, they abstract out the concept of temporality. And through the experience of their own body as embodied and moving and sustained by wetness and warmth, they arrive at the notion of force, power of force, through the contact with the earth. Again, these are all very concrete things. A human being or a group of human beings in a particular place, under a particular sky, in contact with the earth, under their feet, they develop the concept of materiality.
Yes.
And then, of course, in predicting the changes of nature, eventually they understand that they can think in terms of causality. And so causality, materiality, force, and space are all concepts that we abstract from the life world in order to think scientifically. And so we're not objectifying, and we never arrive at any kind of pure object that could be known as it is in itself. But we are abstracting and are able to think more universally, even though this is ultimately grounded in something far more concrete. This is another sort of aspect to this. So the notion of a geocultural climate and the notion of nature in it is also a way of thinking about the problem of universality and objectivity. And perhaps maybe in Hill's view of justifying the life world and seeing how it could be a source of universality.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, especially the examples you used now. I heard of not so long ago at a conference in Chile. There was a professor, and he's indigenous he speaks Kaingang language, and he presented a concept of the self from the Kaingang point of view, and it was very similar to Watsuji's Ningen. Only in one point it was a little bit different, that they include the cosmic energy and the cosmic interaction within the self. But in the other aspects, it was really very similar, as it was a relational self, a collective, individual self, and also a self which included very much the nature within, and also the ancestors as family members. But especially including the nature, and the example you brought with how we experience the life world with our feet on the ground and looking at the sky and experiencing space and time through these perceptions and experience. This is also an elaboration I heard of in Latin America. So this is not something that is only located in Japan, I wanted to say, or not only typical for a Japanese point of view. But maybe at the end or towards the end, I would like to ask the question that is very important and concerns everyone, not only philosophers. Can this new understanding of the self as a relational self and this understanding of including the nature within the self lead to a greater appreciation and protection of the nature?
I hope so.
Is it helpful or?
Well, I think in some ways you could say that philosophers play the long game.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't expect someone to print a newspaper editorial next week about this, or even various sort of media oriented towards intellectuals such as the Atlantic or the New Republic to suddenly begin discussing this. But I think that we, at least in this particular case, are working with a set of concepts, a family of concepts that we try to articulate, and the concepts like Fudo and Aidagara belong on the one hand to sort of popular culture or to ordinary language. Mm-hmm. But Watsuji then turns these into philosophical concepts.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
He borrows this word, but then tries to show how it discloses something about the world or about the way we understand ourselves. And so as he applies these philosophical concepts, what can sometimes happen, and I, as someone who then appropriates these and remakes them or renews them in another language and a different cultural context, what can, I think, sometimes happen is a gradual shaping, perhaps, and certainly through spreading, a gradual shaping of the way that people begin to think. Mm-hmm. So philosophers may begin to just, and that was sort of one of the things that I asked for in the book. I asked philosophers to try to begin to take words like Fudo and Aidagara and use them in their own writing, untranslated. And through their explanation of these terms, that they might become words like phronesis or Dasein for philosophers that we all use now. And so become part of our philosophical vocabulary. But as these things spread and begin perhaps to shape the conversation or shape people's thinking, what may happen over the course of time is a trickle-down effect, so to speak, where perhaps if it gets taken up by other intellectuals in other fields, if it gets taken up in college or high school courses, that it becomes perhaps sometimes part of the discourse of the culture as a whole. We've seen this happen with animal rights.
Yes, exactly.
This language was developed in the 1970s by Peter Singer. And now it's almost part of educated people's common sense in the West. Feminism is another great example, right? That this discourse is developed, it spreads, and who knows? Sometimes it really begins to shape people's thinking and practices. But we can't, I don't think we can expect it to be a kind of product that can be applied and that we'll see immediate results. But perhaps over the years, the decades, the century, that slowly but surely we'll get a new sort of domain that emerges into view for enough people. I think that's sort of the hope of at least certain kinds of philosophers.
I hope very much because you know that the younger people, especially in Europe now, they concern very much about nature, what is something very important for them and for the future generation. And I think that if also philosophers engage more themselves, as Graham Parks, for example, do, not only theoretically but also practically, and add some philosophical notions to this movement and this discourse. That, as you said, it in the course of time it might shape the thinking and the feeling of nature.
Yes, I think that's right. I hope that's right. And at the same time, I'm going to just speculate here, but my sense of this is that this kind of conceptual shaping has to go hand in hand with, and this is not something that I think is in anyone's control, but is most effective when it moves along with the phenomenon of imitation. I think that what motivates a lot of people is what other people are doing.
I see.
And so I think in terms of moral psychology, that so much of what shapes behavior may not necessarily be having very well articulated moral stands or principles about the things, but seeing that, for example, if no one now openly uses racist language, that even people who would want to do that look around and see, well, I'll be condemned, I'll be outside of society in a way if I do this. And so people are watching each other and they're seeing what is more and more considered appropriate or inappropriate. And that's a very powerful force for the choices that people make, the things that they do. I think now people litter a lot less openly. Maybe even they recycle more because everyone is recycling.
Yes, exactly.
And so there's, on the one hand, a kind of perhaps almost blind following along with what's expected, with what everyone else is doing. But also behind that, of course, there's a discourse, there's an articulation of why we're doing that, why we're recycling, or why we're not littering, or why we're not using openly racist language, why we're doing it. So there's a kind of justification on the conceptual level. And maybe there's got to be a sort of feedback loop, or between these, there's a resonance between these things, that there is a way that the concepts and the ideas affect how people are behaving, and the spread of imitative behavior is backed by or grounded in a kind of account that people can appeal to and say, this is why we're doing it. And it's just, I think that the practical part of this, the way that people behave and the way that human beings watch each other and do what others are doing, that seems to be something sort of out of anyone's particular control. But I think that's a kind of analysis that can allow us to see how this might emerge.
And so how can I ask it? How can we percept or how can we behave in interaction with the nature? Shall we embrace trees more, or to bring the other people to imitate and to love nature more stronger, and to I don't know how to put the question, but how can I behave not only recycling the things, but also in a natural, aesthetic way to bring the others to protect, to treasure the nature? What can we do? Do you have some idea, some suggestion?
I have to say I don't have sort of practical recommendations, but one thing that I've thought about, and again, it won't be something that's immediate. It has to be really a shift in the way that we perceive the world. But one thing that I've thought about, and that would affect, I think, people's relation to nature and how they treat nature, what we're calling nature, is the notion that nature is alive and meaningful, and it's replete with qualities and values. And that's a notion that comes out of a certain reading of phenomenology. I mean, there are some figures in phenomenology who see it as the analysis of structures of meaning in experience, but that in fact does not take a stand ontologically or metaphysically, doesn't take up positions in those areas of philosophy. I disagree with those phenomenologists. I won't name names, but there are others like John Drummond and Dan Zahavi and Robert Sokolowski and myself, who think that in fact not only does phenomenology entail certain ontological and perhaps metaphysical positions, but that one can in fact conduct ontological explorations and metaphysical explorations in and through phenomenology, and maybe perhaps even make certain kinds of claims in these areas. And so part of what I think is important here is that with the return to the life world, what we see in Watsuji is also a return to the life-worldly domain of nature, or the life-worldly dimension of nature. So it's nature as a component of the life world. And so what that would mean would be, one could make the argument that we can have a kind of realism about the qualities and values that we encounter in nature. That would mean aesthetic qualities, perhaps even it's possible qualities like the sacred. And these would be properties residing in the things that make a claim on me, that I have to respond to. Things that are intrinsically valuable or have intrinsic value. But just because they make a claim on me doesn't mean that I necessarily will respond. I can be indifferent to intrinsic value amazingly. And so on the other side of it, there has to be perhaps a recovery of the ancient East Asian injunction to self-cultivation, that I've got to become the kind of person who can respond to beauty, who can respond to something that's intrinsically valuable, the beauty of a waterfall, or the sense of sacredness that might come along.
Yes, I believe in the power of natural beauty, that I hope that the people will reconcile when they see how beautiful nature is, or natural phenomenon.
Yes. And so that would be the kind of thing that's, if it becomes common sense philosophically to think what's damaged is really something that is beautiful. It's not my projection. Because of the subjectivism and relativism that's so much part of contemporary common sense. It's easy to say, well, you just think it's beautiful. You just think it's sacred. You just think that it's awe-inspiring. But in fact, it's just matter in motion or something like this, or it's just your view. But if we shift the ontology, if we shift the metaphysical view, and if it becomes much more part of our way of seeing, then we can see that what we damage in nature is not only something biological, which is terrible enough, but we also damage some qualities and some values. We destroy things that are qualitatively valuable in themselves. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And that's the kind of damage that I would hope that people would want to refrain from. I mean, a lot of people have an intuition. Still, it's left over, even though it doesn't match the modern sensibility, but they intuit this about art. Right? When they go to a museum. And now the uproar about throwing paint on paintings, because there's an intuition that you can profane a painting. Right? That there's a kind of profanity there. And so I would like to see the same kind of intuition, that you could profane nature. By polluting, by destroying, by building and developing, that there is a kind of profanation of nature in the same way that we have that sense about works of art.
Yes, exactly. This is something, this is a problem I saw in Japan, because there is something ambiguity, I think, because on the one side, the Japanese people, they very much value the nature and natural beauty and natural phenomenon, especially based on Shinto. You can see on so much places that they are putting this, how to say, on trees or on stones. They put signs.
These cords.
Yes, these cords. Exactly. Thank you. They put these cords to mark holy places and holy stones or trees, and they treasure very much it on the one side, and on the other side we have in Japan extremely pollution of the nature. We have atom energy problems with the atom recycling. And this is something I felt very strong about as I was there. I don't know what do you think? How can these two extremes exist on the same time in the same place?
Yeah, I noticed the tensions there as well, and sort of some of the contradictions when I was living in Japan. And various people have written about this, about the segregation that happens. And so I won't really sort of theoretically go into that, because I myself am not sure exactly why that happens the way it does. But what I would probably say is that this is something that happens in all cultures. And one of the tasks of philosophy, as I understand it, is to articulate to people the significance of what it is that they're committed to, the meaning, the larger meaning of what it is that they're doing, or the broader sort of power and depth of the tradition that they're coming out of. Because so much of the time, I think that the depths of what belongs to a culture is covered over by a kind of superficiality and a shallowness. And so what I think needs to happen is, and it's, I think, the task partly of intellectuals and philosophers, is to bring to light the wider meaning of what it is that really is involved in something like Aida or Fudo, or in Confucianism, what is really involved in the five relationships, or in political virtue, and so on. Because on the one hand, you could just use Confucianism in a very superficial and cheap way to exert power. But if you really dive into the depths of the tradition, one finds beauty and profundity there that can be expressed and shown to people. And and I don't think it's just philosophers or intellectuals who can do this. The Greek playwrights would also do this to the Athenians. Look, Athenians, this is who we are.
Yeah.
What will we do now?
Yeah.
Right, through these great tragedies. This is, I guess, a way of saying this is what culture can do. The culture can be a kind of mirror to show people the true meaning of who they are, the true meaning of their values, and so perhaps can begin to shape the choices that they make and the actions that they undertake.
Thank you very much, David, for this interesting interview, for the insights, and also for helping me with the questions. You explained much better than I put it in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.